Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to today's event on grooming gangs, an important and a very, very difficult subject, and one I don't think has ever had a full panel here before. Today, we are concentrated on what it says here, on justice for the victims. So this year, we've had an extraordinary interest in the story. It's reopened it, particularly the American interest. We've had the government pressured into having a national inquiry and certainly having a national audit already. And we are now looking very seriously at what this means, how we resolve this dreadful crisis, which has gone on now for several decades. So I'm going to begin by sitting down. Sorry, I stood up so that you'd all know we started. The crisis itself, we know, goes back at least to the 1990s. It's been going on now there for over three decades without serious resolution. There were early reports. They were largely ignored. Brave MPs like Ann Cryer. And then crusading journalists became involved. Andrew Norfolk, of blessed memory, who led the charge to look at this awful story, who uncovered so much of it, and who was then promptly attacked and disparaged by so many for having the temerity to talk about the truth. But his work led to inquiries. An inquiry in Rotherham, which revealed that there were at least 1,400 victims. And then there have been other journalists who've led to other inquiries. We know in Telford there were at least 1,000 victims, at a conservative estimate. And we know that there are a great many other towns and cities with thousands of victims as yet undiscovered. This is probably the greatest race hate crime in British history. We are talking about thousands, possibly tens of thousands of girls who have suffered horrendous abuse over a period of decades, and when they went for help have primarily been let down by people in the councils, by people in the police, by those in authority. And so we find ourselves now in a position where there is a possibility, we hope, for change, but it's going to require rigor and it's going to require a lot of pressure to make sure that the forces that would like it all to go away are not able to win out. Now, we still have big questions to ask. How many victims were there? Who knew what? How high up in the police or the council does knowledge of these crimes go? How many criminals are still walking the streets? How many criminals have gone on to new jobs? And will any justice ever be brought against them? To help me with that, I'm very glad to have an extremely good panel here today. Charlie Peters of GB News, who did the pioneering documentary, Grooming Gangs, Britain's Shame, which helped to reignite the discussion. Melissa Todd of Open Justice, who has done pioneering work onto the sentencing remarks and the transcripts of court records, which will, we hope, enable us to understand the severity of these crimes and do the work that academics frequently have not wanted to do, to look where criminologists and people in the police and the NCA and the Ministry of Justice and the Home Office have not dared to look. And Katie Lamb, who I hope is going to talk to us about what it is that we can do on a legislative level. So to start us off, I'd like to ask Charlie if you could tell us about your work with the grooming gangs.
Thank you, Guy, and thank you all for being here, and thank you to the Prosperity Institute for having us. Guy is right. This is one of the worst scandal in British political history. I think it's our worst scandal since the Second World War, and we still know so little about it. The Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, in his speech at Labour conference last week, drew a comparison between the grooming gang scandal and other atrocities in our country. He spoke about Hillsborough, and he spoke about Grenfell, and he spoke about the grooming gangs, and he said, in all of these cases, justice was not done because the victims were black, because they were women and girls, and because they were working class. There's something he missed out there, which is very critical. He didn't speak about the real reason why this had been ignored for so long. It's because the perpetrators, in many of these cases, are overwhelmingly of South Asian and in particular Pakistani Mirpuri heritage. Some of his ministers are now saying that, right? For the first time ever, we have British ministers talking about that this year, and that is due to the enormous pressure that's taken place through journalism, through victims and survivors, their families and campaigners, talking about this issue relentlessly, even as the entire system, the establishment, the media, the political class, has essentially conspired to look the other way and not engage with this crisis. Now, there have been many promises that this will change. We'll have this inquiry, and finally we're going to get to the bottom of the truth about this issue. And that was sparked in part, I believe, because of what GB News was able to reveal at the start of this year, on New Year's Day, which is that the government had rejected a request from Oldham Council for a government-led intervention into the town. Now, we were aware of that for about 2 months. We got our right of replies, we got FOIs in, we got all the letters involved, but we delayed releasing the story in order for it to have maximum impact. We just so happened to time it at the same time that a certain Elon Musk was getting very interested in this story, so I'm glad I held on to it. And that then led to the same day, Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the Conservative Party, calling for a national inquiry, and I do think that without the Conservative pressure, that call in June would never have happened. I think it's essentially a Conservative political victory because we saw the efforts of Labour ministers to avoid pushing that forward. But we're in a very tricky situation now. On January the 16th, Labour ministers said there would be a local inquiry in Oldham on the reaction to all this pressure that we were able to kickstart. The GB News can be very proud of that. And then we were told local inquiries would be locally led work on the feedback from local authorities. Funnily enough, they weren't very keen on this, who would have thought? And then Baroness Louise Casey conducted that audit. And Louise Casey did a thorough job, but she reaffirmed what we already know, which is that we don't know very much. And the reason why we need a national inquiry is because there are so many gaps in information, that the ethnicity of abusers are still not being recorded, that women and girls are being sidelined, that many of these perpetrators, we don't understand the cultural, religious, or ethnicity motivations behind their abuse. This is just questions that have been ignored for so long. Currently involved in working with some researchers about asking about the links between cousin marriage and grooming gang abuse, because it creates clannish networks where you prioritise the safety and security of your family over that of girls who are being abused. That strikes me as such an important and vital question to ask. Why is it being left to researchers to find time anonymously to work together to get that information out, that the government should be leading on this? But the problem we have now is that I was quite optimistic in June. So were many of the survivors and campaigners and their families I spoke to. We are now in a very dangerous space, I think, where 9 months on from the first announcements of local inquiries, I now start to fear that this national inquiry will either come in a different format to what was promised or will be watered down enormously. And GB News had a story last week that I think points out just how real that risk is. Now, women and girls in Oldham have been promised a lot this year. A local inquiry, a national inquiry, but we revealed last week that they are now being offered a truth project. Truth project. So I know that a very senior civil servant who's been on loan from the Cabinet Office to the Home Office has been attending meetings with the Home Office and Oldham Council to engage with this process, what will come next. Now, I understand that Oldham Council is very furious, basically, about this. They want to get going. They've made this promise to women and girls. They've made assurances to people, and they've been told they're going to have money. As I understand it, the money they've been promised has changed up and down. We're arguing over like 5 million quid here, you know, for a government that makes billions of pounds of pledges all the time. They're still counting pennies when it comes to finally uncovering the truth of this atrocity. And they're also pushing forward a truth project. Now, we were able to reveal last week that that had been rejected. Oldham Council, it would be politically impossible for them to accept a truth project, but it won't stop at Oldham. Through other sources in government, I am highly confident that other towns and cities that have resisted this inquiry for so long are going to be offered the same thing, and I'm worried that some of them are going to accept it. That instead of having a statutory powered-led inquiry where people can be dragged in front and forced to give testimony, then instead there'll just be a process of basically truth and reconciliation. Share your experiences and let's all move on. But I think for a lot of these communities, and they have been overlooked by the media and the political class for so long, there is no moving on from this. This is a life of pain. This is a life of suffering that you can't move past if it's not recognised, if it isn't actioned. And that is the very difficult space we're in right now. And I think the Labour peer, Maurice Glasman, he says we need show trials. Don't go that far, but I do think we need to see some people really suffer for this, not just perpetrators. In Rotherham, more people have been to jail in Rotherham for the riots last August on one day than they've been in prison for grooming gang abuse from 1997 to 2016. That's a scandal, that's a disgrace. That one day of criminality could overcome 1,510 victims in that town, at least. But there haven't been any cases where social workers or police officers or politicians who failed these children have been having their feet held to the fire. They've all been allowed to retire, move on, or just move jobs in some cases, often in the same sort of work. Having failed in social services in one place, just move on elsewhere and do the same sort of thing. Now, I think the Oldham story is the most important story I've ever done in my career. It may forever be that way, and I'd be delighted if that was the case, because it really matters. But there's another story this year that I think GB News can be extremely proud of, and that was when we held the testimony of a former police officer called John Picos. Now, he was a detective superintendent. He worked in Oldham Police. He retired, and he looked into these abuse networks around the country. And he went to Bradford, a town that's never had an inquiry. ICSA went to Warwickshire. It went to St Helens, but it didn't go to Bradford. John Picos said that in a 3-month period when he was observing a children's care home and he saw this pattern of abuse that we've seen replicated in over 50 different towns and cities across the country, of Pakistani men taking children away from a social care home and taking them away for the purposes of sexual abuse. When he saw that going on, he gathered all this information. I've spoken to other sources who work with him, very reliable and compelling people. He brought this information to the police and social services, and they threatened to arrest him. They told him, "You are putting these children at risk." And they also told him, and this is the central issue for this, in my view, they told him that he risked revitalizing, this was in 2004, the race riots that had blighted that town just a few years earlier. Now, John Picos is an extraordinarily brave man to come forward and share that information, and a complaint has since been passed by the Shadow Home Secretary to the National Crime Agency, who are currently assessing that, to prosecute that man. I've not named him. I know who he is. He knows I know who he is. But we'd like to see the course of justice go out before we put his name in flashing lights. But I think he knows that that time is coming. What I'm worried about is that there are many other police officers and social workers and politicians and local council officials who did similar things who are not nervous right now, because they can see what's coming down the line is Truth Project, not investigation. That is what this needs. This is what this country needs, frankly, and it's what all the victims around the country who've been so badly affected by this scandal need. They need inquiry, investigation, justice. They need to see people punished. Thank you.
Melissa, could you tell us about the work you've been doing with Open Justice and some of what you've found looking at these transcripts?
Hi, thank you for being here. I'm sure a lot of people in this room will remember in January when grooming gangs were sort of thrust into the news again. During that period, one of the most compelling documents was a set of sentencing remarks, which is the very end of a trial. In this case, it was for a trial for an Oxford gang way back in 2013. And the reason it was so compelling was because it was long, it was detailed, and unlike cases where the remarks aren't published, you're not reliant on journalists to choose what to omit and what not to omit. And also it came from a judge who people rightly or wrongfully trust. Because this was so compelling, I went looking for similar transcripts, and there weren't any published. We don't routinely publish sentencing remarks in the UK, unlike many other countries. It's totally up to judges' discretion. If judges think that it's of the national interest, they'll do it, and I think it speaks volumes that there are only 3 cases over 100 trials where judges have thought it was in the national importance to publish the sentencing remarks. So with Adam Wren, who's in the front row here, I set up Open Justice in January. We crowdfunded around 100k to apply for these sentencing remarks ourselves and eventually publish them. We thought it would be quite easy. It's just requesting a document. We thought it would be wrapped up by now. We are definitely not. I think rightfully people think that there's a massive amount of sort of conspiracy and cover up in the grooming gangs, and they're absolutely right. One of the worst, most egregious things we had was one judge looked at our application and said because grooming gangs were in the news again, it was not in the public interest for anyone to have this transcript, which is ridiculous. But also so many of the issues are very usual British bureaucratic hurdles, but the worst case scenarios. To give a few, we do not transcribe court cases. We just put the audio on CDs and they go into archives. If that audio is more than 7 years old, it has to be destroyed because of data protection laws. So if there's a case from as recent as 2018, if there's been no court reporting on it at the time, we can't get any information on it. It's gone. They destroy the audio. a lot of the information that we need to apply for these transcripts is held by companies that provide digital services to law firms. So like the reference numbers that you have to give the courts and stuff. We applied to a bunch of these companies to get the information, and they denied it to us. So we had to get it sort of by just digging into articles. And it means there are many cases that we just cannot apply for. Courts are also just horrendously slow at dealing with these applications. There are ones that I submitted in January that I'm still chasing up on. They somehow lose something that I've emailed across as a digital PDF. I don't know how you manage that. And the costs are astronomical. Fiona, one of the survivors we work with, is in the front row. We applied for her full transcript recently and we were quoted £37,000, which is like no normal person can pay that. And even for people that had crowdfunded it, that was almost half our budget. And the reason they're so expensive is because the system is really poorly set up. Each court will have a mandated transcription agency they have to work with, and you have to agree to their costs. You can't like go around and find a cheaper one. And these agencies are also terrible to work with. They'll often blank you. We had one where it turned out the company wasn't real. It had been bought out. We couldn't get through to the fake company or the real company for 3 weeks. We had a friend who worked at an office nearby the office listed for this company. He went in to follow up on the application for us, and they treated him as a security threat and they kicked him out of the office. In the end, we had to get the Ministry of Justice themselves to chase them, and then they did reply very quickly. When we do get the transcripts, there's still hurdles to publishing them. Very rightly, you have to redact all victims' names and personal information. Very sensible. The transcription agencies are meant to do this, but they do a really bad job. We've had at least 20 transcripts back where they have left victims' names in, victims' addresses in, which is incredibly dangerous. Not only should we not have this information, it also means we need to go to third-party lawyers to redact the transcripts, but this has been impossible. We've approached nearly 30 law firms and conversations will start, but they'll eventually say that they can't help us. It's now likely we'll probably have to go to the US to find a law firm willing to do this for us. Of the transcripts we have around 30 now. They do show trends and aspects of cases that aren't reported on otherwise. To give a few examples, Charlie spoke to this a bit already, but we get direct testimonies from care workers where they show just how complicit they were. They'll talk about going to the weddings between the children that were groomed and the groomers. They'll say that at the time they thought it was good. They had a more mature boyfriend. You'll also hear from police that actively said, oh, I lost my case note, so I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't go back to get an interview. And you'll also hear testimonies from family members. You'll hear the mothers who aren't prosecuted, or the brothers or the uncles who give evidence, say, oh, they're a good boy, they wouldn't do this, even when victims have testified and said that the mum was completely aware. She was in the house at the time that the rapes were going on. Also, one thing you get when you're looking at so many transcripts brought together is you realise we often look at grooming as a really local issue. Oh, this was like the Oldham gang, this was the Oxford gang, but you'll start to see both victims and defendants' names that are mentioned across transcripts, and you realise this is a national issue. They're interconnected gangs. Girls are being trafficked between networks of Asian men in different cities, and it's something you really only see when you have multiple transcripts with all the case information sort of set out in front of you. You also see that alongside rape offences, they're often prosecuted with gun crime or drug dealing offences at the same time. I think this shows why I personally usually say grooming gang. I think rape gang does speak to the depravity more, it's a stronger word, but the grooming aspect is incredibly important. These girls are often involved in sort of like weapons trading between gangs, drug dealing, and these they get convicted for these things and it stays with them for life, and that is just as big a part of what they go through. These addictions stay with them, so I think the grooming aspect there comes through more. We also get to see parts of the trial that are hidden from the jury and the media. These are called in-chambers parts of cases. To give two examples, during one trial, defendants were taking drugs in the toilets, and that was hidden from the jury. They said that could not go to jury or media. And also they were harassing both court staff and cafe staff, and instead of placing them in jail during the trial, they let them stay out on bail and just banned them from going into the cafe. As for the inquiry, the most broad point I'd like to touch on first is from our work, both working with survivors and looking at the transcripts. I worry that a lot of the framing the government is going with is that it's like a victim-led approach. I don't think it's fair to victims to have heavily traumatised people lead the framework for work looking into what they went through, both because it's incredibly traumatic and also because their experience won't get those more zoomed out parts, like the national aspects, and also the cultural drivers, the ethnic drivers are not going to be at the forefront of their mind. That's not always necessarily going to be the most traumatizing part for them. And if the girls don't push it, we know the government definitely are not going to push those parts. And I can really see a scenario where maybe we get something resembling what Charlie said, and the government will say, well, this was victim-led. Why aren't you happy with the setup that victims have wanted? And that's not fair for the inquiry, and that's also just not fair on the victims themselves. On transcripts specifically, I hope that they're used in trials. I think the government may see access issues in the same way we did, especially because many are deleted, but they're quite useful instances where all the evidence is like condensed into one place and they can see those wider networks start to form. And then finally, I hope it does see change for transcript access. We know the government have already said that they're going to make transcripts free for rape victims, which is great and right, but it should be free for all victims. And also they've done nothing on the fact that it's really hard to get to the bit where you are able to pay. I think it's so important that the grooming gang trial is investigated. It warrants it itself, but I also think it just shows so many of the worst failings that we see elsewhere in this country. It shows the worst failings of the police, of the care system, of the fact that we've actively imported people and cultures that are just savage and backwards and should not be here. And at the end, it shows all the failures in the transcript application process. And I think there's no better case than the grooming gangs to push for better transcript access. And if you fix it because of the grooming gangs, that will be good for all victims. Same as if the grooming gangs lead to us addressing how the police deal with girls in care, or how care workers interact with older boyfriends, that will be felt with, like, across for all victims of all crimes.
Katie, would you like to tell us about what you think parliamentarians can and should be doing?
Yes, definitely. Firstly, I'll say thank you so much for having me. And I'd like to start just by acknowledging, Charlie mentioned some already, but the incredible work of so many courageous people whose determination to bring this to light and whose bravery in doing so has made it possible for us even to be having this conversation today. The whistleblowers who exposed the truth of the institutional cover-up, the journalists who told the public, most of all Charlie sitting here and the late Andrew Norfolk, whom Guy mentioned earlier, and Guy for all of his meticulous research behind that sort of reporting. Campaigners like Melissa and Adam at Open Justice UK, who've done a remarkable job getting the records that the state does have, like court transcripts, into the public domain. And finally, and most of all, to the many, far too many victims and survivors of these unspeakable crimes and their families, whose ability and determination to speak out about what has happened to them never ceases to amaze me. I come away from every conversation even more humbled than before. I'll talk a little bit about what we've been doing in Parliament, the latest from the government, and what could and should happen next. So. As the panel have mentioned, this has been going on a horrifically long time. But we have, I think, made some recent progress. In the last government, Suella Braverman, and I must declare an interest because I work for her, although not on this, showed real courage speaking about this and founding the Grooming Gangs Task Force, which has contributed to well over 1,000 arrests of perpetrators. I am a new, well now relatively new, Member of Parliament. I was elected last year, and since then I've been part of a growing call, very much led by Kemi Badenoch and Chris Philp, for a national inquiry. And as Charlie outlined earlier, we've seen, at least on the surface, a sort of complete about-face by the government on this, who insisted it was a far-right bandwagon in January and announced a public inquiry in June. But that announcement is unfortunately the beginning of the next chapter of pressuring the government to do the right thing rather than the end. It is absolutely critical that the terms of reference for the public inquiry, which haven't yet been published, are right. We still don't know what it will look like. The most recent quote from a sort of Home Office spokesperson was at the weekend on a story about what they might do in Bradford and West Yorkshire, which said, "We have committed to a new national inquiry which will undertake specific investigations locally." And what I worry that is hiding is what they are essentially going to do is have local inquiries with a sort of coordination function. And that is not good enough for several reasons. Firstly, local inquiries don't have statutory powers. If you cannot legally compel people to come and speak to you, and if you cannot legally compel evidence, it should be immediately obvious to anybody that no one is going to opt in to criminalize themselves or incriminate themselves. So unless you make people come and speak about what they've done, and unless you compel that evidence, we simply will not find out what's happened. I think that there is also, Melissa already talked about sort of trends across the country, but by definition, it is not possible for people in each area to know what was unique to what happened to them and what actually is a trend across the nation. We know, again, as Melissa mentioned, that these are nationally networked gangs. We know that children were trafficked up and down the country. And so if we are looking at this only locally, we are only looking at part of the problem and therefore part of the solution. And it also, I think, will very likely mean that we will not see the reckoning for the state cover-up that we must have if we are to move forward as a country and move beyond this, the greatest stain on the British state in living memory. It is very important that this inquiry is nationwide, but also, which is something that I'm worrying we're starting to see in how it's being talked about in West Yorkshire, it has to be specific to this particular phenomenon of groups of Muslim, predominantly Pakistani and Pakistani heritage men rounding up and sexually torturing mostly young girls and some boys. If we make it more generically about child sex abuse, about child sex exploitation, then we know how difficult it is to get the system to look head on at this problem. If we allow them instead to look at other problems that they do feel more comfortable discussing, then that's what they will do. They will not spend time properly looking at this, and the situation will not be resolved. But also, fundamentally, not a single person, no official, no police officer, no counsellor has ever been prosecuted for covering up these crimes. And the systematic cover-up that it has taken to hide tens of thousands of victims and perpetrators is almost unimaginable. The idea that this could be nobody's fault, that nobody bears criminal liability for this, is utterly beyond credibility. The local officials, the local police officers, the local counsellors who have failed these children, and I'll just take a moment to be honest about what that means, because it's easy to speak in sort of more sanitized terms. You know, when we say failed these children, what we mean is that they were abandoned to large-scale gang rape. The people who knew, the people who let this happen, the people who built cultures so afraid of being called racist that they let children pay this unspeakable price, they belong in prison. And only a proper national inquiry will ever manage to do that. Just to take one example, there was a case recently where some of the perpetrators were convicted, and the coverage talked about the fact that the local social workers had talked about a 10-year-old as being a prostitute. Now, I don't know if you can imagine a 10-year-old that you know, but the idea that a 10-year-old could consent to selling sex for money, I think, is completely unconscionable. But this is the sort of thing that these people convince themselves and one another of, not to face the realities of the horrors of the situation. And unless we root this out all the way to the bottom, then we cannot, in good conscience, move forward as a country.
So as the moderator, I'm going to ask everyone one question, and then I'm going to ask one question from the audience, and then I'll bring questions to everybody else, okay? Charlie, as a journalist, as an investigator, as somebody who's been doggedly following this story now for years, what do you think is still out there that hasn't been revealed? What is the biggest thing you think that's out there that has not been revealed yet?
It's been touched on briefly before, but I think the organised criminal gang element of this is absolutely vital. Work I did earlier this year with a group called Crush Crime was to demonstrate visually the interconnectedness and the interoperability of these groups across the country, to show that there were trafficking and organisational links between gangs in Bristol, as there were in Rotherham, in Bradford, in Newcastle, Hull to Barrow, and right across the country. And to that point, on a subsection of the links, to reveal London, to expose how crucial London has been to this crisis. Now, Sadiq Khan has rejected on 7 occasions questions on whether or not we've had a grooming gang scandal in the capital. He said, "What do you mean by that?" as if he's not been following the coverage for the best part of a decade now. But the answer is yes, London does have a problem. We're still working on gathering that testimony, but more and more people are coming forward now very bravely for the first time, inspired by people just asking the question and showing that they care about them, having thought that they were an outlier and someone, you know, to be ignored as they had been ignored as children. So to show the links between Class A drugs, in particular heroin, and the abuse networks, that the men who deal in that drug also use it as a tool to groom and hook the girls as part of their access. The links also with gun crime and how these men, as organised criminal gangs, have gun running and access to tools of serious violence at all times in many cases. And also to show, and this is going to be a clear example of what Katie was referring to there, the nervousness to talk about how they are interconnected, not by criminality, but by blood and by an ethno-religious sense of connectedness. That they are linked by religion, of course, but really by blood. That these are cousins in many cases, looking out for one another, raping alongside one another, and most critically, and this is still to come, it's been hinted at in a few cases in the past, that those overlaps in familial links don't just happen in the gangs, they happen between gangs and the authorities as well. We know about, in Rotherham for example, how a police officer called Hassan Ali facilitated the handover of a girl between abuser Arshid Hussain and deputy leader of the council, Jahangir Akhtar, in exchange for Arshid Hussain not being prosecuted. We know that when Arshid Hussain was started to be investigated for that incident, that he was run over and killed by a family friend on the very same day. What a coincidence. We also know, for example, that there are many other cases where family played a part in preventing these things being revealed. We're currently dealing with a government that's going to be able to set these terms of reference and set the scope of this inquiry, that is petrified of criticising minority culture and behaviour, right? That they are so nervous to even respond to Richard Holden talking about cousin marriage in the House of Commons, for example, even when there's so obviously an issue with health defects and the suffering of children. If we can't expect them to talk about that and engage in an open debate on it, or even, you know, God forbid, legislate on it, how can we expect them to have a serious conversation about socio-biological kinship and cousin marriage and how that is used to cover up crimes? It's been done a bit before. You know, we've done a lot of work on that already at GB News, but there's so much more to come on that, and I'm nervous, very nervous, that the state isn't willing to accept that truth.
Melissa, on that sort of line, one of the things that marks these gangs out is the nature of their offending. Because, of course, rape itself is not, you know, that's a wide crime, and one of the ways in which this discussion is diffused is to just lump it in with everything else. There is no specific crime for grooming. There is no specific grooming gang crime that you can look at in the statistics. And people will look at it and say, well, most sexual abusers, most child sexual abusers are white. But there are unique characteristics to this. You know, firstly, that you know, most child abuse is generally either by strangers or it is by people within family groups. What's unusual about this is it's by closely related groups of people, or generally closely related groups of people, and in particular, that it targets people outside of their group. Because most child abuse is within communities, within families. That's how they find their victims. This is unusual in that it's picking a group that is explicitly outside. Now, it's not to say that all the victims are from that community, I think I'm right in saying in Rotherham, of the 1,400, about 150 were Muslim girls and boys. So they were abused as well. But generally, that was more likely to be a one-on-one situation that was happening in secret, whereas these are group abuse. It's groups coming together and abusing. In the court transcripts, you mentioned that the mothers and the daughters would defend their brothers, husbands, cousins. Is there anything within those transcripts that sort of reveals more about why it is that they seem to be choosing to defend their sort of family links over what the truth is?
I think part of it's a cultural thing. If you look at like sort of the ways their mothers would have got married, I imagine many of them would have been children, so it just registers as normal to them. I think in the way it's presented in court often, they do not differentiate between good and bad family involvement. When they're doing the sentencing remarks and they list mitigations, they'll often say you're very close to your family, you're a good family man, even though often they'll have family members either directly in the gangs or, as you said before, their mothers will come in and basically cover up for them. So I think it's particularly useful to have a family member in court. Their testimonies are seen as useful. I also think it speaks to more widely, we need to look at like how the communities facilitated it. Like they'll say they took the girl into massively public places, so it's not just families that will defend them, it's sort of the bartenders or people who run corner shops where they do it above are often just as complicit. So it's not even family, it's like my community, right? It's almost like a clan system. I mean, there are cases where they say that they'd have a girl over at a house and they were having sex with her and they phoned 50 friends. I don't think, or I'd like to think no one in this room has 50 friends, or even one friend you could call and say that you're raping a child. It's just totally unthinkable.
I just interrupt very quickly on that. I mean, just to give an example of that, Sagir Hussain, when he raped one girl for the first time outside a Boots convenience store in Rotherham, most rapists tell their victims not to make noise. He told her to scream so that his friends would notice and come and watch.
These are just things that just should not be recognisable in Britain, but they increasingly are, and it's something we've actively done to ourselves. Like, these people don't just fall into the country, we welcome them in. So yes, I'd say one, for families, they just don't recognise it as bad, and then two, in the wider community, there's sort of like a clan system where they do it and they enjoy it.
Shocking. Katie, going forward, obviously the Conservatives are not in government, and there's a sort of limited ability to affect what's going to happen. What do you think is the most useful thing? Do you think that pushing for the national inquiry? Do you think going through the different committees? Do you think that the new Hillsborough law, which enables you to make sure that statutory inquiries, that public servants that talk to statutory inquiries, that provide evidence, must not withhold the truth, or else they can be prosecuted? Do you think that can be brought to bear? Particularly to make sure that, as Charlie said, we're not just getting these sort of truth-seeking exercises, that every inquiry that happens is statutory to make sure that those protections exist, and that if public officials fail, they can be brought to account for that.
Well, I'll start on the last bit of your question about the Hillsborough law. So that is, in fact, another reason why it's crucially important that we have a proper national inquiry, because it's actually not clear from the way that the Hillsborough law is written, and we will be looking to do something about this in Parliament when Parliament sits again from Monday. But it's not clear the way that the Hillsborough law is written if they do try to and get away with doing these as diffused local inquiries, whether they will actually be caught by that, or whether that only applies to the sort of statutory situations that we've been talking about. So there are 100 reasons why this will need to be a full national statutory inquiry, but the application of the Hillsborough law as it currently stands is one. In answer to your question about what can be done, there are many different pathways, and at the moment, to the best of our ability, we, by which I mean the Conservative Party, is trying to take all of them, by which we can keep the pressure up on this issue. A huge amount of that is just speaking in the chamber, and what we're ultimately looking to do, which is maybe the deeper or more thematic answer to your question, is keep pressure on the government by shaming people into realising quite how appalling it will be if they don't do this properly. And part of that is having the courage to call out these crimes for what they are, and that can obviously be very unpleasant to talk about and to listen to. But if you sanitize it too much, then it becomes easy to sort of pretend that it wasn't as bad as you can hear from some of the examples from Melissa and Charlie. Wasn't and isn't as bad as it was and is. But the main thing really that everybody can do is acknowledge the fundamental truth of what's happened and make noise about it. I mean, it is hard to speak in public repeatedly about the sort of crimes that we're talking about, but it is in the silence that all of this has festered for several decades, and unless all of us are willing to do our part in bringing it out into the light, that's where it will stay.
Thank you very much. We're now going to turn to questions and answer, but before we start, the very first one, have we got some microphones? I'd like to ask Fiona here in the audience to speak. Fiona is from Bradford. She's a survivor. She was a member of the Independent Inquiry into Child Sex Abuse, and I'd like to ask you what you think the victims need most.
So, I am going to echo a little bit of what has been said, but from a different perspective. Like, this is personal experience rather than investigation. So, when I gave evidence into the ICSA, the questions were pre-decided and it limited what I was allowed to talk about. I was about to talk about a tiny little fraction and everything else was irrelevant. So there is deep concerns that this inquiry is going to end up going that same way. And until recently, I was a very big advocate for survivor-led investigations, but recently I have had experiences that makes me question how much the survivors are being manipulated and meddled with to come to a position that the government would suit the government's narrative, and they would then be able to hide behind saying it was the survivors' voices that led them to that decisions, and we would end up with another ICSA where grooming gang victims would be forgot about and put on the back burner. So trying to widen the scope, also trying to meddle with how it would investigate. I'm a big believer there needs to be a mixture of both national and localised views. There are certain places within England, we know CSE and the grooming gangs in particular are happening basically all over the country, but there are certain places that are involved in near enough every single case. I'm from Bradford, that's one of them, and I'm not saying this just because I'm from Bradford. There are other cities that come up in most cases, like Birmingham and even Blackburn and places like that. I think there needs to be a submission basis where evidence is gathered from across the countries and it's compelled to be gathered. They can't have an option. These whole Truth Project things, Bradford has been against an inquiry. I've been fighting since 2014. If they offered a Truth Project, they would take it and it would become a whitewash yet again. And my whole life that I've spent either being abused or fighting to expose that abuse would just be wasted again. And I think this is the real risk, is though it seems to be survivor focused, I don't believe it is. I think it is being influenced into something that the survivors will not be happy with and will not hold accountability in any areas. I will also echo from personal experience the links and the specifics behind these types of crimes. They are organised networks, and not most child sex abuse is opportunist. It's isolated and opportunist. This is not. It's an organised network, and they are involved with every other aspect of criminal activity. And there is specifics, and to try and generalise that with other types of child sexual abuse takes away what happened. And in these instances with these specific types of abuse, they got a different type of response from the people that were supposed to protect us. And if that's not acknowledged, we're not going to get to the full truth of why that happened, who made the decisions. Because, as being said, you cannot believe that every single police force, council and social services across the country did not understand or were misguided in the mass rape of children. It come from somewhere, and I feel that there's a lot of questionable stuff right now, and I am concerned that the survivors are again getting exploited while being tricked into thinking that their voice matters. and I don't want to see that happen again.
Absolutely not. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, questions. Could we have the lady here with the lovely leopard skin?
Thank you. I hate to keep bringing this back to Bradford, but I'm actually the leader of the opposition at Bradford, and I've worked with Fiona for a long time, and also our MP for Keighley, Robbie Moore, on this. And just give you a bit of a flavour what we've been up against in the Bradford district. When we've brought motions to council about this, calling for a full statutory inquiry, and that has to be key. The statutory really has to be key on this. We get called racist for bringing a debate on it and calling. This should be something that every councillor, every elected person should be shouting from the rooftop to support, but they're not. We are called racist for bringing this up. And the bravery of the survivors and the families who have been affected by this is absolutely fantastic. And I think we all need to just keep fighting for them and for people who are still being affected by this. And thanking the panel for keep fighting for this. And sort of a question really for the panel is, we've got a new Home Secretary. Where's her voice at the moment on this? Because we're not hearing anything that's coming out of what the new Home Secretary is doing and where this is in her priorities. So I don't know if the panel have got any reflections.
Would you like
got
to-
some on this.
I know you've got a thought, and then I'll go to Charlie.
Yes, I'll answer the question about Shabana Mahmood, and then there's something I'd just like to add as well to what Fiona was saying. It's not completely clear. It looks like she might be more keen to do something meaningful than the previous Home Office team was. But the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. And I think in all scenarios, my sense is that even if she did want to do that, she will only get away with doing that in the context of her own party if we keep the pressure on. And you mentioned Robbie Moore, who has done incredible work in advocating for his home on this. But it's even if she wants to do the right thing, I think that will only happen if she's put under sustained, unbelievable pressure. I just wanted to add something briefly to what Fiona said, which is this is absolutely about justice for victims and survivors, and it must be. But it is also, in a way, about justice for all of us. We deserve to know what has happened in our country by different arms of our government in our name. We deserve to know. And so not only is it a further violation of these people to use them as a sort of cover-up for not having a proper investigation, it also doesn't answer that question to which all of us need answers.
Charlie?
The Home Secretary has changed, but the Safeguarding Minister is still Jess Phillips. Now, Jess Phillips made a remarkable admission responding to a question in the House, providing an update on this issue in August. Now, in July, the BBC and GB News sort of worked together to reveal that 3 police officers under investigation for this sort of abuse, we'd spoken to their victims and they provided testimony for the first time. GB News could additionally reveal at the time that one of the complainants in that case had the name of her perpetrator revealed to her by the IOPC, and that's a real disaster because it means that it can affect your ability to identify them in a parade. It has a serious knock-on effect for justice. So still lots of failures going on. Now, Jess Phillips, in reaction to what BBC and GB News revealed there, in August she said, "I know that police officers have been involved in this abuse." She insinuated she'd known for some time. So why on earth did she call for a national inquiry in June on the recommendation from Louise Casey when she has known for some time that police officers weren't just involved in the cover-up of this abuse, but were actually actively complicit in it? And I also think I know who she's talking about when she refers to being aware of police officers involved in this abuse. And I think it points to what we were talking about earlier, some of the nervousness that Labour ministers have around this issue because of the perpetrators. And again, to echo what Katie Lamb has said, Shabana Mahmood has not said anything about this since she's come into office. But in May, before we had an indication of what Casey would say, she did say this country needs a reckoning on the grooming gang scandal. And I think that is stronger language than any other Labour figure has used on this issue since it returned to prominence in January. But again, it's just that, it's language. And what we're seeing at the moment is this sense of delay of the terms of reference being produced in a way that you've just heard Fiona being a bit concerned by. But also what we were able to reveal last year, that some authorities are being offered truth projects. Those are actions, and those actions are very disturbing.
The lady in the white blazer at the back there. Oh, there's a...
My name is Nirvana Mahmood. I'm a new member of the Conservative Party, and I'm a progressive Muslim. And I was born in Egypt, a country with high incidence of sexual harassment. Not as bad as what happened in Britain, but I will tell you the elephant in the room is to have the courage to address Islamism, which is not Islam, it's an ideology. Social Islamism teach men not to respect a woman who is drunk, who is not wearing hijab, and treat her as, unfortunately, as a piece of flesh. If we should not shy down from addressing this cultural misogyny that should not exist in this country. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we get the lady there in the middle with the golden earrings? Sorry, right in the middle. Are they gold? I'm not quite sure, sorry. There's a microphone just behind you. There you go.
Can I just say that while we're talking about the grooming gangs, I think there should be a shout out for the marvellous Maggie Oliver,
Yeah.
who has worked tirelessly. She was a police sergeant, I think she was. She was so horrified by what she found, the complicity of the police, that she resigned and started the Maggie Oliver Foundation. Now she works she lives locally to us in near Trafford, and we invited her to come and speak to our Conservative luncheon group. She told us things no parent should ever have to hear about their children, and things that really aren't in the public domain at the moment. And she's been vilified, she's had death threats, she's been banned from here, banned from there. She's had a terrible, terrible time, and this is something that really we should be spending a lot of time, a lot of money to try and sort out.
That's a question.
Absolutely. Can we get the gentleman in the back with the glasses?
I just have a simple question. Is there any... how dangerous do you think the rise in sectarian Muslim MPs will be for the actual grooming gang inquiry? Because they tend to be from that same community. Do you think there'll be a clannish forming of ranks to kill the inquiry?
Does anyone wanted to...
I'll do that.
Yeah.
Adnan Hussain, the MP for Blackburn, called for a national inquiry before Labour did. Isn't that curious? An independent MP in Blackburn, he backed this. And we had some polling done for GB News by JL Partners in January that found that actually, when it comes to the punishment of perpetrators, ethnic minority Britons, that includes, of course, South Asians, and there are some 1.7 million Pakistanis in Britain, though they were more severe in the sort of punishment they wanted to see. In fact, a plurality of them thought the death penalty should be returned for organised groomers. So I am concerned, however, these are specific examples, I am concerned about sectarian politics, often by foolish white liberals who think they're doing a favour to other communities to come out and prevent further investigation, believing they're doing that community a favour by covering up an overrepresentation of criminality within their community. And that's really, unnervingly, that's been the big lesson of towns like Rotherham, Telford, Rochdale, Oldham, is that obviously you see facilitators within the council who quietened discussion, Pakistani councillors who quietened discussion about taxi drivers, for example, who pushed forward false accusations of racism to stop it. But the real organisers were senior white figures who did such things as booking Home Office researcher Adele Weir on a 2-day equality and diversity course because she recognised the pattern. She compiled basically a good intelligence product on the abuse ring in Rotherham, and she was sent away for political re-education because of the truth. That was not ordered by sectarian politics. That was ordered by white leftists trying to cover up for criminality within their town. So it does concern me, but I think there's also this bigger fear we have as well at the same time of that same effect taking place.
With the gentleman on the end there. Oh, there's a microphone just coming. There you go.
Two quick things. One, you talk about this as if it's in the past. Is it still going on?
Yes.
And second of all, you say it's been going on for 30 years. And the Conservatives were in office the last 14 rather. Are there serious failings with Home Office ministers in the Conservative governments of that period? Because you're talking about it now and you're very animated about it, but why were they not doing anything from 2010 onwards?
Maybe I'll pick that one up. I think that the short answer is I can't say definitively because I wasn't there, but I think that the unwillingness to confront the reality of these crimes, of their systematic nature, of the racially and religiously aggravated and motivated nature of them, I think it's fair to say pervaded pretty much every element of the British establishment, almost every political party until very recently. Like I say, Suella Braverman, I thought, moved the national conversation on a very long way. It was not that nothing was achieved under the last government, but it has taken far too long for far too many people to be honest about this. And I think the reality is the same for previous governments as it is for lots and lots of institutions, is at best, I think, a sense that this was so horrific that almost by definition it couldn't be true. In the middle, a sense that people didn't even look at it properly because the whole thing was so obviously explosive and uncomfortable. And at its worst, it's proactive cover-up. I don't get the sense that the Conservatives were guilty of the last of those three. But it has taken far too long to be honest about this and to look it squarely in the face.
I'm afraid we're running out of time, so one last question. If I get the lady here with her hand up in the centre. There's a microphone just behind you.
We should speak to Marlon as well, Father.
Oh, sorry,
as well.
All right, we'll get Marlon.
My name is Julian Salem, and I was wondering, I mean, I've heard I've just wondered if it was possible to have more information on what's gone on and whether, as a group, it can be circulated. I don't know whether that's legally possible, but if more people knew about it, maybe that would help. Yeah. I'd certainly be interested in much more. I mean, obviously we've heard it ongoing for years, but never the full facts. So would that be possible to share the information?
More facts, definitely. Marlon, do you want to add something? The microphone's just behind you.
Hi, I'm Marlon West. My daughter was groomed only 2 years ago. It's a question for you, Katie, sorry.
No, go on.
So I speak to a lot of families, a lot of survivors, and what's being said at the moment is a lot of worries about the terms of reference. However, these are rumours, but it wouldn't surprise me that they're diluting the terms of reference. How can Conservatives counteract that?
A couple of different ways. One of them, which I think, I know that we are exploring and we're still talking about, the best way to do that would actually be to write our own. And so to be able to demonstrate where the terms of reference fall short relative to what they should be. I think my personal view is that's probably the most straightforward way to do it. You can critique and criticise things once they've been written, but I think it's easier to be able to say, well, they should be this, and here are all the ways in which they fall short.
Will you do that? Will the Conservatives do that, write their own terms of reference?
And would you speak to survivors to inform the terms of reference?
Yes, definitely. If we were to do that, that's the exact plan for how we're going to tackle this hasn't yet been finalised. But I think that would make a lot of sense.
Can I add also
Yeah,
quickly, both the infected blood inquiry and the Horizon one with the police officers both had their terms of reference changed after they were published. So it is totally possible. And if the government says it's not, they're lying.
There we go. So I'm afraid we're out of time, but the answer is keep up the pressure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming.